She handed back the ring in front of everyone, dropped it right onto the restaurant table, let it spin twice, and walked away with the man she had chosen instead. She thought she was destroying him. She had no idea she was handing him back the one thing that no longer mattered. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days earlier, Marcus Webb had quietly signed a $15 billion oil exploration deal in a Houston boardroom, and his name was now on more contracts than she had ever seen in her entire life. If you've ever been publicly humiliated by someone who thought you were worth nothing, stay right here, because what happens next is the kind of story that reminds you why patience is the most dangerous weapon a quiet man can carry. This is the story of a man who said nothing at that table and let everything else do his talking for him. And before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that like button and subscribe. We tell stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Now, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. Whether you're tuning in from Atlanta, Houston, Lagos, London, or somewhere entirely unexpected, we want to know. This community is everywhere, and we love knowing who is watching and from where. Marcus Webb had grown up in a household where money was something you were aware of in the way you are aware of weather, always present, always a condition of existence, rarely discussed directly. His father had worked the line at a restaurant in a mid-sized southern city for 11 years, the kind of place that stays in a neighborhood long enough to become part of it. His mother had done bookkeeping for a small dental practice until Marcus was old enough for her to take on a second client. They had been, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a family that made things work. Nothing was wasted, nothing was ostentatious. There was a decency to it that Marcus had absorbed without ever articulating, the way children absorb most of the important things. Silently and permanently. He had been the kind of student who was easy to underestimate, not because his work was poor, but it wasn't, and people who paid attention knew it, but because he produced it without performance. He turned in papers that were excellent and said little about them afterward. He earned his undergraduate degree in geosciences at a state university on a partial scholarship. He supplemented with weekend work, then his graduate degree at a research institution where his thesis on subsurface formation analysis had been noted by exactly 3 people. His graduate advisor, a petroleum engineer who had read it in an academic journal 2 years after publication, and years later, himself, when the work proved foundational to the most significant professional development of his life. He had been 31 when he met Vanessa Caldwell at a mutual friend's engagement party held at a private rooftop venue in the kind of neighborhood where people drive slowly on purpose. He had been invited by his friend David, who knew Vanessa tangentially and had not been entirely certain his invitation would extend to a +1. Marcus had worn a suit that was good but not new. He had stood at the edge of the party in the early minutes, the way people stand at the edge of things they are not entirely certain they belong to, and Vanessa had come over and introduced herself with the specific directness of someone who has identified a person of interest and intends to pursue the interest efficiently. She was beautiful in the way of women who have been told so consistently and for so long that it has become merely a fact about them rather than a source of pleasure. She was quick and sharp and funny in the brittle, practiced manner of her social world. Marcus had found her compelling. He had also, somewhere below the surface of finding her compelling, registered something he did not fully examine, a quality of assessment in the way she looked at people, as though she were calculating their value before deciding how much attention to allocate. He had not examined it closely. He had been 31 and she was beautiful, and she had come over to talk to him, which felt, in that moment, like reason enough to set the observation aside. Vanessa's mother, Diane Caldwell, had the kind of beauty that had curdled over the decades into something harder and more deliberate. She smiled with every muscle except the ones around her eyes. From the very first dinner to which Marcus was invited, a Sunday meal at the Caldwell family home, a large colonial on the east side of town, maintained with a vigilance that was essentially performative. She had looked at him the way a woman looks at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite match the room, not ugly enough to discard immediately, not something you'd put on display. "He's very sweet," she had told Vanessa that first evening, which in Diane's vocabulary was the most polite available synonym for irrelevant. Vanessa's brother Philip was 2 years younger than his sister, operated a small commercial real estate consultancy that was perpetually on the verge of its next significant transaction, and lived by a social philosophy that could be summarized as, be seen with the right people and the right people will think you are right. He had shaken Marcus's hand at that first dinner with the professional warmth of a man who has assessed you in 3 seconds and slotted you into a category and has enough social grace to be pleasant about it. And Vanessa, who had her mother's eyes and half her mother's ambitions, had still married him. Marcus had believed in those early years that this meant something real, that love had won out over the Caldwell family's careful accounting of social worth. He had been wrong about that, though the wrongness took time to reveal itself fully. He had simply not understood yet that Vanessa had married him the way some people buy a house in a neighborhood they don't love, with the firm intention of renovating. She had spent the next 6 years renovating him, and when the renovation proved impossible, she had quietly arranged a replacement. His name was Derek Holt. He was Philip's business partner, a man who wore his suits like a second skin and talked about his investment portfolio the way other men talked about their children, with a kind of reverent, chest-swelling pride that made everyone in range feel faintly accountable. He had made his money in commercial finance and property development, and in Caldwell family terms this translated to a form of presence that Marcus, for all his professional credentials, had never been able to project. Derek spoke their language. He knew the right restaurants, the right resorts, the right anecdote to deploy at a dinner party to make everyone feel pleasantly inferior without being able to identify why. He was everything the Caldwell family understood and valued. He had, in Diane's precise words at a brunch Marcus had not been invited to, the right kind of presence. Marcus found out about Derek the way most men find out about things like that. Too late and by accident. He had come home early from a field assignment in West Texas, a project that had been consuming him for nearly 8 months. The work was a contract geological survey for an independent energy firm, the kind of engagement that paid modestly and kept him away from home more often than not. He had looked forward to finishing it and coming home. He had come home to find Vanessa's car in the driveway and Derek's parked beside it, with the particular familiarity of vehicles that have been in close proximity before and expect to be again. He had not made a scene. That was the part people found hardest to believe when he told the story later, though he rarely told it. He had stood in the driveway for a long moment, taking in the 2 cars with the focused attention he usually reserved for geological formations, and then he had gotten back into his own car and driven to a diner 3 miles away. He had sat in a corner booth for 2 hours drinking coffee that grew cold, staring at the laminate tabletop in a way that was not exactly thinking and not exactly not thinking. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A woman in a booth across the room was doing crossword puzzles. The world was entirely ordinary around the edges of what had just happened, which was the strangest part. He had not gone back to the house that night. He had checked into a motel that cost $62, was adequately clean, and had a window that looked over a parking lot. He had sat on the edge of the bed in the fluorescent quiet and tried to identify, with the same systematic precision he brought to subsurface analysis, exactly what he was feeling. What he found, beneath the hurt and the shock and the grinding humiliation of it, was something he had not anticipated, a kind of relief, as though something he had been half seeing for a long time had finally come fully into focus, and the effort of not quite seeing it was finally over. The marriage had not ended that night. It had ended in the slow, methodical way that certain structures fail, not with a crash, but with a series of quiet internal fractures that only become visible when the whole thing finally gives way. Over the following 3 months, Marcus had moved into the spare bedroom, filed initial paperwork with an attorney he paid from his personal savings, and continued going to work every morning as though the floor beneath him was solid. He had become, in those months, a man who was extremely good at carrying weight without showing it, which was, it would emerge, a talent he had been developing for considerably longer than 3 months. His attorney was a woman named Carol Brandt, compact, efficient, possessed of a legal mind that cut through sentiment the way a scalpel cuts through tissue. She did not waste words, and she did not waste time. She had reviewed the marriage's financial records with the thoroughness of someone who expects to find something interesting, and she had not been disappointed. "You own this house," she said, at their second meeting, sliding a document across the desk toward him. Marcus nodded. He knew this. The house had been purchased 4 years into the marriage with a combination of his savings and a loan taken out solely in his name because Vanessa's credit had been compromised at the time by an outstanding judgment from a business venture she discussed rarely and without detail. The deed bore his name. The mortgage bore his name. The house, legally and without ambiguity, was his. "Does she know that?" Carol asked. Marcus considered it carefully. "She knows the deed is in my name. I don't think she's given serious thought to what that means." Carol looked at him steadily. "Most people don't," she said, "until they have to." What Marcus had not yet told Carol, what he had told no one, not even Raymond, who called every Sunday from Denver and listened without interrupting, was what had happened in Houston several weeks before their first meeting. It had begun, as things of this magnitude often do, with something that appeared at the time like a minor variation in a routine assignment. 8 months earlier, when Marcus had taken the West Texas field contract, the work involved geological surveys of a 40,000-acre private land tract in the Permian Basin. He had done this kind of work dozens of times across his career. He mapped formations, he filed reports, he was paid his contracted fee. Reliable and professionally unremarkable, which was exactly what his employer and his client wanted from it. But Marcus had been reading geological formations for 15 years, and he had learned over those years to trust something beyond the strict interpretation of his instruments, a pattern recognition built from tens of thousands of hours of direct contact with the Earth and its history, an accumulated fluency in the language that rock uses to describe what lies beneath it. And the rock on this particular tract was telling him something that made him stop one afternoon, stand completely still in the dust and the heat, and stare at the ground beneath his boots for a long moment. The formation signatures were not routine. The subsurface indicators, the pressure gradients, the porosity readings, the structural geometry of the reservoir formations, were consistent with a hydrocarbon deposit of a scale he had encountered only once before in his career. That previous encounter had preceded a find in the Bakken that produced revenues in the hundreds of millions over its first decade. He had been a junior team member then. He had observed and noted and filed it away. He was not a junior member of anything now. The Foss Tract was owned by a private holding entity whose principal was an elderly man named Gerald Foss, a retired schoolteacher who had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his, and who had never given its commercial potential serious consideration because no one had ever given him a reason to. Through Marcus's firm, a meeting was requested with the landowner's representative. Then another meeting. Then a series of conversations that escalated in formality and seriousness until Marcus found himself in a Houston conference room across from a panel of petroleum engineers and energy attorneys representing Meridian Energy Partners, an independent energy group that had been tracking Permian Basin land assets for 4 years. They had reviewed his survey data independently. Their engineers agreed with his analysis. The deposit was real, was significant, and Gerald Foss, who attended one of the final negotiation sessions in a sport coat he had clearly ironed himself, was prepared to enter into a development agreement because Marcus's survey had finally given his inheritance a reason to matter. The question of the surveying geologist's position in the subsequent venture was raised near the end of the final session by Meridian's lead attorney. Marcus had been prepared for this. He had, quietly, and with the advice of an independent Houston attorney, he had retained, for the purpose, prepared his response. The consulting equity stake he negotiated was 4.7% of net revenues from the Foss Tract development, structured through a limited liability entity in his name, with a guaranteed minimum draw that exceeded his annual salary by a factor that still made him feel slightly unreal when he looked at it directly. The projected yield from the Foss Tract, based on the formation analysis he had authored himself, made the $15 billion headline in Meridian's eventual SEC announcement look, in the opinion of several petroleum economists, conservative. The paperwork had been executed 3 days before Vanessa's dinner. He had not told Carol about any of it. He had not told Raymond. He had told no one because he was still sitting quietly with the reality of it, in the way a man sits in a diner with cold coffee, letting a new fact find its place in the world before deciding what to do with it. The dinner had been Vanessa's suggestion, delivered in the tone she used when a decision had already been made and she was announcing it rather than proposing it. A restaurant called Maison Dorée. Amber lighting, no prices on the menu, the kind of establishment designed to communicate that money is too refined a matter to be mentioned directly. She had said they needed to talk. He had understood what that meant. He had not anticipated that she would bring her mother, or Philip, or Derek. He arrived to find all 4 of them already seated, drinks half finished, arranged along the far side of the table in a configuration that left one chair isolated on the near side, his chair. He had the immediate, clear impression of walking into a proceeding that had been organized without him and had, in some sense, already begun. Diane looked up with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific moment for 6 years and intends to conduct herself in it with the dignity she believes it deserves. Philip had not quite been able to meet Marcus's eyes since Marcus sat down. Derek sat beside Vanessa with the practiced stillness of a man who has been given his role and is content to perform it simply by being visible and well-tailored. "Marcus," Vanessa said, "sit down." He sat. What followed was approximately 14 minutes of a speech Vanessa had clearly written in advance. She covered the loneliness of a marriage in which her husband was perpetually absent on field assignments. She covered the slow and painful realization that they had fundamentally different visions for their lives. She covered the years she had invested in something that had ultimately failed to become what she had needed it to be. She spoke with the modulated, managed sorrow of someone performing sadness rather than experiencing it. Though the line between the two, Marcus had learned, was something many people never quite identified in themselves. Diane interjected at intervals that felt scripted. Philip said nothing, Derek said nothing. They were set pieces, props arranged to communicate the weight of family endorsement behind this moment, the collective agreement that what was happening was right and reasonable and overdue. "And what exactly is it that you deserve?" Marcus asked at one point. It was the only question he asked in those 14 minutes. Diane answered for her daughter before Vanessa could speak. She deserves someone with ambition, someone present, someone who can actually provide the kind of life she has built herself for. The phrase landed and stayed. The casual, confident grandiosity of it, as though Vanessa had constructed herself for a specific tier of existence, and any failure to deliver that tier was a form of breach of contract. Then Vanessa reached into her purse and placed the engagement ring on the table. Not her wedding band, the engagement ring, the round solitaire he had saved 3 months for, carried home from the jeweler on a Tuesday afternoon in a small blue box with his hands not entirely steady. She slid it across the tablecloth with 2 fingers, the way a person returns something borrowed and no longer needed. "I think you should have this back," she said. "If I'm being completely honest, it wasn't ever really the kind of ring I wanted." Diane made a small sound in the space where a laugh might have been. Philip looked at his drink. The couple at the nearest table had gone quiet in the particular way of strangers who have found themselves present at something they were not supposed to hear. Marcus looked at the ring on the white tablecloth. He thought briefly of the Tuesday. Then he picked up the ring, held it for a single moment, and placed it carefully in the breast pocket of his jacket. "All right," he said. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He folded his napkin, placed it neatly beside his untouched water glass, and stood. "I'll have Carol reach out to your attorney early next week," he said to Vanessa. "There are some matters we'll need to discuss, primarily about the house." Vanessa's frown was brief and involuntary. "What about the house?" "Carol will explain it. Enjoy your dinner." He buttoned his jacket and walked out of Maison Dorée into the cool evening. On the sidewalk, he stood for a moment, breathing steadily, then took out his phone and called Raymond. Raymond answered on the second ring, the way he always did. "She did it in front of the mother," Marcus said. There was a pause on the line. "The whole family? Mother, brother, and Derek?" A longer pause. "Marcus, I'm all right." "You don't have to say that." "I know," Marcus said, "but I am." He drove home, his home. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and read the Meridian Agreement one more time. Not because he needed to, but because he needed to. He read the equity clause and the guaranteed minimum draw and the projected revenue ranges. He closed the laptop and went to bed and slept more soundly than he had in many months. The next morning, he called Carol. She listened the way she always did, completely without interruption, with the focused quality of attention that made a person feel genuinely heard. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about the equity structure," she said. "Slowly," he told her. She listened with a kind of stillness that is not patience, but precision. When he finished, she was quiet again, longer this time. "Marcus," she said finally, "this changes the entire picture, significantly." "I know." The prenuptial we drafted, the separate property clauses, were written specifically to cover this kind of professional asset. You were meticulous about that at the time, which I remember you being criticized for by certain parties. "Diane called it insulting," Marcus said. "Diane is currently going to find it very inconvenient," Carol said. "I'm bringing in my colleague who specializes in high-asset dissolution. This needs a second set of eyes, and it needs them quickly. Are you prepared for what happens when this becomes public record? What do you mean? The SEC filing, when Meridian announces your name is going to be visible to anyone who looks for it. The world she inhabits is going to know. Are you ready for what that looks like? Marcus thought about Diane's small, satisfied sound at the table. Philip looking at his drink. Derek sitting there as a demonstration of what adequacy looked like. "I'm prepared to proceed correctly," he said. "Every step transparent, every document in order. I want nothing that gives anyone reason to claim later that I acted improperly." "Then let's do it right," Carol said. The disclosure document Vanessa's attorney received 3 weeks later ran to 47 pages. It contained the full structure of the Meridian Equity Agreement, the limited liability entity, the petroleum economists' projected revenue ranges, and a careful accounting of the separate property arguments grounded in the prenuptial Vanessa had signed, reluctantly at the strong insistence of Marcus's then-attorney, 6 years earlier. At the time, the prenuptial had been treated by the Caldwell family as a minor indignity, a cold formality that the less-than-ideal groom had insisted on before they could proceed with the marriage they had graciously permitted. It had sat in Carol's files for 6 years, untouched and essentially forgotten. It was now the most significant document in the entire matter. Carol's colleague reviewed the prenuptial, the Meridian Agreement, and the origination timeline, and delivered his opinion in 2 sentences. The equity stake was separate property. Vanessa's attorneys could push back, but they would not succeed. They pushed back in 3 directions anyway. Carol's team addressed each one in the patient, document-heavy manner of people who have navigated this specific road before and know exactly how much time and money the other side is willing to spend on arguments they are going to lose. The call from Vanessa to Diane happened on a Tuesday morning. It was not, by Philip's later account, which reached Marcus in fragments through Raymond's network of connections, a composed call. Vanessa had read the disclosure. She had read it twice. She had called her mother in a state Diane would later describe to Philip as completely unlike her, and the words that stuck were the ones Diane apparently could not stop repeating, with the bewildered wonder of a person encountering a fact that contradicts the entire architecture of what they believed. "Mama, he has real money. He's been building this the whole time and none of us knew." Diane's response, per Philip, was a silence long enough to become its own answer. Then, "How much?" Vanessa read her the conservative projection figure from the disclosure document. The lower range, the number their own attorneys would later confirm, was real and accurate and not a clerical error. Diane did not respond for several seconds. Then she said, "Get me a better lawyer." 3 weeks of aggressive legal posturing from Vanessa's side produced nothing actionable. Carol's team answered every motion with the measured, exhaustive thoroughness of people who have the facts and the documents, and the patience to wait out anything that doesn't. The House notification, the formal legal communication that Vanessa was required to vacate the property within 60 days, was served on a Thursday afternoon. Vanessa called Philip. Philip called Diane. Diane, departing from every precedent in 6 years of indirect management, called Marcus directly. She had never done this before. Her campaigns had always been conducted through the architecture of social arrangements, through exclusions and atmospheres, and the precise calibration of which invitations were extended and which were withheld. To call him directly was to acknowledge that the architecture had been overwhelmed, that the situation was beyond the tools she normally deployed. He answered on the second ring. He let her speak without interruption. She covered, in sequence, the years of hospitality she had extended to him with no real acknowledgement, the sacrifices Vanessa had made for a marriage that had ultimately been a disappointment, the cruelty of a legal system that could reduce a woman to 60 days' notice in her own home, the fundamental indecency of a man who used accumulated wealth as a weapon against the people he claimed to have loved. Her voice was controlled for the first several minutes, and then less so, and Marcus listened to all of it with the same attentive stillness he brought to everything. When she finished, he said, "Diane, there is a difference between the home someone lives in and a home someone owns. I think you understand that distinction, even if it is painful right now." "You are going to destroy her," Diane said. "I'm going to follow the law," Marcus said, "exactly as I've been doing from the beginning. I would suggest Vanessa use the 60 days productively. Carol's office can answer any questions her attorney has about the process." He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen of his house in the quiet of an evening that felt, for the first time in years, entirely and unambiguously his. The Meridian SEC filing went live on a Monday morning. The headline figure, $15 billion in projected extraction value over 20 years from the Fast-Track development, traveled through financial news feeds and industry publications with the velocity of things that contain real money. The geologist whose survey had identified the deposit was not named in the press release. He was named in the regulatory filing, which any interested party with database access could find in under 20 minutes. Derek found it in approximately that time. He called Philip, Philip called Diane. Diane did not call anyone for several hours. She sat with the information in the way a person sits with a reversal so complete that the initial response is simply the inability to reframe it. She had spent 6 years constructing and distributing a narrative about Marcus Webb. "Sweet," she had said, "not the right fit." Modest in every sense that mattered. The dissolution had been presented by Diane, to friends, to acquaintances, to the network of people whose opinions she both influenced and monitored, as Vanessa reclaiming her self-knowledge. A woman who had been too generous, finally honoring what she deserved. The problem with that narrative was that it depended entirely on Marcus being what Diane had assessed him to be. And he was not. The social correction did not happen all at once. It happened the way status corrections occur in tight social worlds, in a series of small readjustments, each one individually minor, that accumulate into a shift unmistakable to those fluent enough in the language to read it. Invitations that arrived later than they used to, conversations at events that went faintly, briefly quieter when Diane walked into the room. A committee appointment she had expected that was given without explanation to someone else. A lunch with 2 close friends that was cancelled and never rescheduled. None of it was explicit. None of it needed to be. Diane could read every syllable of it, and she did. She had told everyone that her daughter had married beneath herself. The man she had dismissed with the word sweet had turned out to be someone that the circles she inhabited, circles organized entirely around the kind of wealth she had spent her life cultivating proximity to, would have welcomed eagerly and respectfully. The embarrassment of this was total, and it was not addressable, because addressing it required acknowledging that her accounting had been wrong, and Diane Caldwell was constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that she had been wrong. So she said nothing, and the silence cost her more than anything she could have said would have. Derek's departure from Vanessa's life had the efficiency of a man updating a position in a changed market. He did not have a conversation about it. He did not make a speech. He simply became less available over the span of 3 weeks. Messages slower, then occasional, then absent, until Vanessa understood from the arithmetic of decreasing contact what had happened without anyone needing to explain it. Philip told Vanessa the truth on a Sunday night, 2 days before she moved out of the house, when she called him from a living room filled with boxes in a state he later described as the most honest he had ever seen her. He told her that Derek had always been more interested in what she represented than in who she was, that this had been apparent to him for some time, that he had not said anything, and that this was a failure he regretted. Vanessa was quiet on the phone for a long moment after that. "Why didn't anyone ever just tell me the truth about anything?" she finally asked. Philip didn't have a clean answer. The honest one was that their family's entire operating system had been built around the management of appearances rather than the exchange of truths, and that Vanessa herself had been a committed participant in that system for as long as anyone could remember. But he didn't say that. He said he was sorry, which was true, and which was the right thing to offer in that moment, even if it was incomplete. Marcus, meanwhile, was working. The FOSS-track development had entered its active phase, which generated a continuous stream of briefings, site visits, and operational meetings that kept him moving between Texas and Louisiana with the focused purposefulness of a man who has spent a career preparing for a problem of exactly this complexity. He was also working with a financial advisor at Carol's recommendation, a quiet and thorough man whose first question at their initial meeting, "What do you actually want this to do for you in your life?" Marcus found so refreshingly direct that he spent 45 minutes answering it carefully. What he wanted was straightforward. He wanted to continue doing the work at the level it required. He wanted to stop thinking about money as a daily condition of existence, the way it had been a condition of his parents' existence and his own in the years of modest salaries and field contracts. He wanted to do something useful with the difference between what he needed and what he was going to have. The scholarship fund was established within the first 6 months, named without announcement for his father, supporting graduate students in applied earth sciences with a preference for those from working-class backgrounds who demonstrated the kind of financial constraint the scholarship was designed to remove. His graduate advisor called him when the fund was announced and was quiet on the phone for long enough that Marcus briefly wondered if the call had dropped. "Your father would have liked knowing about this," his advisor finally said. "I think so," Marcus said. He also drove one Saturday afternoon in October to the city where his father had cooked those 11 years, sat at the counter of the restaurant, which was still there and still a little worn around the edges in the comfortable way of places that have no reason to be anything other than what they are, and talked to the woman at the register who remembered his father as a man who had something good to say about every shift, even the hard ones. Marcus left a sum of money on the counter that made her stop and look at it, and then look at him with an expression he did not try to interpret. "For whoever needs it," he said. He drove back on roads that felt, the entire way, like they were his. The final meeting with Vanessa took place in Carol's conference room. Neutral territory by mutual agreement, a room in which Carol was entirely comfortable and no one else quite was. Vanessa arrived with her attorney. She was composed in the way of someone who has practiced composure in front of a mirror rather than arrived at it organically. She looked, Marcus thought when he saw her, like a person who had been through something real and was not yet sure what it had made her. The documents were ready. Terms had been agreed through attorney correspondence weeks earlier. No surprises, nothing contested, everything handled with the cleanliness of a matter that has been properly managed throughout. There was nothing to discuss. But Vanessa had asked, formally through her attorney, for a few minutes with Marcus alone before the signatures. Her attorney had advised against it. She had asked anyway, with the quiet firmness of a woman who has recently started making decisions based on what she actually wants, rather than what is strategically advised. Marcus had said yes. They sat across from each other in the small side conference room for just under 10 minutes. He had wondered, in the days before, what she would say. He had imagined anger, concentrated and precise, directed at him with the articulate force of someone who has had months to prepare it. He had imagined coldness, the managed affect that was the Caldwell family's default under pressure. He had not anticipated what he actually found, which was neither. She was tired, not from sleeplessness. Tired in the deeper way, the way people are tired after sustaining a performance for a very long time without interruption. "I didn't know," she said. She said it without the inflection that turns a statement into a defense. "I know you didn't," he said. "I keep trying to figure out if it would have changed anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think it would have. That's the part I can't quite sit with. I was treating you the way I was treating you before I knew anything about money or oil fields or any of it. The money isn't actually the point." "No," Marcus said. "It isn't. I think I decided what you were worth before I really looked at you," she said, "and everything else followed from that decision. I just kept building on top of it because I'd already decided." He considered this. It was the most honest thing she had said to him in years. Possibly the most honest thing she had been capable of saying in the context of their marriage, which had not been a space that rewarded honesty especially. "I think you're right about that," he said. She was quiet again. Then, "I'm sorry, Marcus, not for the divorce. I think that's the right thing, but for how I did it, and for a long time before." It was not the kind of apology that undoes anything. Nothing undoes things. It was the kind that simply acknowledges what happened and makes no request in return. And it was worth something because of that. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it. They signed. The attorneys exchanged the careful warmth of professionals who have concluded a complex matter well. Carol walked Marcus to the elevator and said, in her customary precise way, "That went well." From Carol, it was the equivalent of a celebration. He drove back to his house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and called Raymond. "It's done," he said. "How are you feeling?" Raymond asked. Marcus looked out the kitchen window. The neighbor's oak tree had gone deep green in the late afternoon light, the kind of saturated color that makes trees look briefly lit from within. He watched it for a moment. "Like I can go to work tomorrow and mean it," he said. Raymond laughed. Marcus laughed too. The kind of laughter that doesn't require anything to be funny. Just two people who have known each other long enough to know when the hard part is over. A year later, Marcus met Sonia. She was a hydrologist with the Federal Water Authority, and she had opinions about subsurface water movement that she expressed with an animation she was occasionally embarrassed by, and a directness about everything else that was completely without guile. Their first date was coffee that became dinner because neither of them noticed the time passing, which Marcus had learned by now was one of the most reliable indicators of something worth pursuing seriously. He was right about that, as he had been right about the Foss Tract. Diane Caldwell continued to inhabit her world, which remained organized around the currency of appearances, but the exchange rate had shifted in ways that proved irreversible. Some things, once publicly corrected, do not return to their prior values. She had spent 6 years telling a story about a man who had turned out to be something entirely different from the character she had assigned him, and the social accounting for that kind of sustained public error is ongoing, private, and does not respond to management. Philip eventually learned, in the slow way of people whose realizations come from discomfort rather than insight, to say true things to his sister more often. This did not transform him overnight, but it made him more honest in small ways, and the small ways accumulated. Vanessa moved into a smaller apartment in a different neighborhood and took a job she had been overqualified for, and did it well, because she was, underneath all of it, capable. She had simply spent years measuring that capability against a standard that had nothing to do with what she actually was. She was working on something by the account that reached Marcus occasionally through the thinning network of mutual connections. He did not know what, and he wished her well with it. Not performatively, not with the edge of a man who needs someone to have been punished. Simply, he wished her well, because holding otherwise would have been a waste of his attention, and his attention was now engaged elsewhere, in better things. Here is the truth at the center of this story, and it has nothing to do with oil fields or legal documents or the sound a ring makes when it lands on a restaurant table. It has to do with what happens when the people surrounding you have made a fundamental category error, when they have looked at your quietness, your steadiness, your willingness to do serious work without an audience, and have read all of those qualities as evidence of inadequacy, when they have confused the absence of performance for the absence of substance, when they have looked at a man who carries weight without showing it and decided because he does not perform his carrying that he must not be carrying anything at all. They will be wrong about you for exactly as long as the facts permit them to be wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the facts arrive the way they arrived for Marcus Webb, all at once, documented, witnessed, and irrefutable, in a 47-page disclosure that reorders the entire room. The world is full of people like Diane Caldwell, people who have constructed an accounting of worth so narrow and so loud that it cannot register anything operating below the frequency of display. They are not necessarily evil, they are not unusual, they are people who have made a category error and repeated it for long enough that it has become their entire way of seeing, and they are the most dangerous kind of wrong, the kind that is absolutely certain of itself. The world is also full of Marcus Webbs, doing the slow, foundational, serious work in fields and offices and laboratories and classrooms, carrying more than anyone around them knows, patient enough, or simply focused enough, to let the work speak for itself when the time comes. These are not people who are hiding their worth. They are people who are building it, and building things that matter takes longer than performing things that look like they matter and cannot be rushed. What would you have done in Marcus's position when they slid that ring across the white tablecloth in front of everyone and the whole room went quiet? What would you have said? And what would you have left unsaid? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, please give it a like before you go. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps more people find this channel. And stories like this one deserve a wide audience. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There is a story coming that I think you are genuinely going to want to see. I'll see you in the next one.